It's great to see so many familiar names and faces. My name's Catherine Matthews, and I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for attending tonight's talk. I'd also like to thank our friends at Hubtown Tours for their support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. At Old North, we are committed to sharing the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. The Old North Church sits on land that was once the land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes, but they did not disappear, nor should their stories and memories. In 2024, as we draw nearer and nearer to the 250th anniversary of the nation and the intervening anniversaries of events like the Lantern Signal at Old North, our speaker series talks will engage with the idea of revolution. On February 28th, novelist William Martin and playwright Patrick Gaybridge will share a conversation about what it means to write historical fiction about revolution. And by the way, Patrick is the author of Revolution's Edge, the original play commissioned for Old North's 300th birthday, which will be coming back to Old North for a 10-week run beginning in June. In March, author Barbara Berenson will help us mark Women's History Month with a talk about the suffrage movement here in Massachusetts and the many ways in which Black activists and working class organizers fought for suffrage, even as many white leaders ignored their efforts. She will also discuss the battle over historical memory that continues to influence how we remember the women's suffrage movement. And speaking of revolutionary women, on April 11th at Old North Church, Old North Illuminated will honor Commander Billy Farrell, the first female commander of USS Constitution. Tickets for Lanterns and Luminaries will go on sale soon. But tonight, we welcome Robert Darnton to speak about his critically acclaimed book, The Revolutionary Temper, Paris 1748 to 1789. Professor Darnton is the Carl H. Forsheimer University Professor and Harvard University Librarian Emeritus. He was educated at Harvard University and Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He taught at Princeton from 1968 until 2007, and at Harvard until his retirement in 2015. The most recent of his many books on cultural history are Censors at Work, How States Shaped Literature, A Literary Tour de France, The World of Books on the Eve of the French Revolution, Pirating and Publishing in the Age of Enlightenment, and of course, the topic of tonight's talk, the revolutionary temper. So with that, a final reminder to mute your microphones, put your questions in the chat, and enjoy tonight's program. Robert, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be part of the great series of speakers you had at Old North. And I think this is a time when we can consider revolutionary traditions. I'd like to begin with something that I think everyone has heard 100 times, namely, we live in an information society. That's true as far as it goes, but it's also misleading because every society was an information society, each in its own way. And if you take that observation seriously, it can lead to some surprising conclusions, including a new way to understand the coming of the French Revolution. Now, I'll just talk about Paris during the period 1748 to 1789. And a point there is that Paris had no newspapers, unlike London and Amsterdam, which were a good century ahead of it. It didn't have newspapers because it was an absolute monarchy, with a strong censorship, and it simply the monarch didn't allow news to travel. Uh, the first daily newspaper, the Journal de Paris, didn't appear until 1777, and it didn't have any real news in it. It was heavily censored. So, what did you do if you wanted to find out about current events? Well, one thing Parisians did was to go to the tree of Krakow. Now, the tree of Krakow was a large oak tree in the northern part of the garden of the Palais Royal in the middle of Paris, where everyone could enter and talk about happenings. These people were called nouvellistes de bouche, that is to say, newsmongers who communicated news by word of the mouth. And the word coq in French slang at that time meant a lie, or what today we would call misinformation. So every time one of the nouvellistes, these newsmongers, gathered under the tree and said something that was misinformation, the tree supposedly went cock. Well, this it was an important institution, and so important that a lot of foreign embassies sent agents to pick up what information was beginning to spread through Paris, or they planted information by sending their agents there. And people would then take notes. They would stick the notes into their sleeves or their waistcoat pockets. They would then go to other nerve centers in this oral communication system, and they would read the notes on certain benches in the Luxembourg Gardens or in the Tuileries Gardens or in some marketplaces or salons. So this oral information began to spread. And as it spread, it became transformed into other means of communication. We know a good deal about one of the centers that contributed to the spread of news. That was a salon run by a woman called Madame Doublet. Now, Madame Doublet was gathered together every day people who were just fascinated by news and wanted to be informed in a place, in a kind of society without newspapers. So every morning she would send out one of her servants. She lived in the Marais section of Paris, who would go to the servants' quarters in the other big aristocratic buildings and pick up gossip from the servants. He would then come back to her apartment where there were two registers. The first register was for very doubtful news, just unbelievable rumors for the most part. The second register was for news that was probably accurate. Then the guests would begin to arrive, and they would read the information in both registers. They would add what they could. And once they had all gathered, they would sit around a table and just gossip about current events. After a good meal, they would retire, and another servant of Madame Doublet would write a sort of digest of the most trustworthy entries in the day's register, the good register. This digest would be sent to the daughter of Madame Doublet, whose servants would copy it and send out copies to yet other places, and the copies would be copied. And before long, these daily reports were circulating all into the provinces of France, even into foreign countries. So you got, in effect, an underground newsletter. And then inevitably, a printer in the Low Countries took these bulletins and put them into the form of a book. 36 volumes called the Mémoires secrets sur l'histoire de la République des Lettres en France. It's an extraordinary collection of gossip, political news, fashions, a little of everything. Um, and it was one of 31 of these uh, underground news sheets that circulated everywhere. So what we're talking about is a kind of informal journalism that grew up and that shows how information would pass from word of mouth to handwritten documents and finally into print in ever widening circles. Um, so you could begin to ask, uh, what about ordinary people? Because they didn't go to salons, they didn't go to cafes. The police had, we estimate, 3,000 spies who reported about what people were saying, especially in cafes. It's also in marketplaces. So the police archives are very revealing about the way information traveled. Um, but uh, I think it's fair to say that most people had only the vaguest idea of foreign affairs, even of foreign geography. I've done a study of all the reports about what you could call the First World War, the War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748. The last battle in that war was the Battle of Lauffeld, and it's fascinating to see the reports about what actually happened. The first reports were sent by the king, who was a spectator. He didn't command the troops, but he dictated a note to a page who got on a horse, galloped off, and 2.5 days later, the news arrived in Versailles saying, "We have had a great victory." Then it spread to Paris, and people felt wonderful, except the next day, uh, casualty lists began to arrive from the commanding officers. And it looked as though a lot of French soldiers had been killed. After that, some foreign newspapers arrived in Paris, and they gave a very different version of things. The Gazette d'Amsterdam, for example, a Dutch newspaper, said that the English had, the enemies of France, had lost 2,000 men, and the French had lost 14,000 men. And they said that the number of pennants and flags captured by the English was much greater than the number of flags captured by the French. In fact, it said that the English had retreated, but to occupy a more powerful strategic position, leaving the battlefield to the French, but really stopping them in their tracks. So people began to say, wait a minute, was this a victory or was it a defeat? And according to some police reports, which I found in the archives, the people said in cafes, uh, they we won the battlefield and we lost the battle. So that's an example of how vague and blurry and ambiguous information about something really fundamental, a world war, actually was. And as to the peace, well, how did people know about the peace? Ordinary people in Paris. The answer is it's by its publication. But publication at that time meant not just setting material texts into type and printing them, the publication of the peace at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession was a spectacular parade. 800 people in great costumes, plumes on their hats, on horses, on foot, with marching bands, spent a whole day going through Paris. They stopped at 13 different sites, so all of the city was covered. There would be a rolling of drums and a blowing of trumpets, and then the royal orator would stand up and he would say, peace has been declared and the English can circulate in France, the French in England, and that was all. Then that evening, there would be a traditional ceremony which involved dancing in 25 different neighborhoods of Paris, free wine, free bread and sausage. And after that, a celebration of fireworks. Now, the Parisians loved fireworks. Fireworks in the 18th century were quite different from what they are today, but it was a favorite spectacle for everyone. So the fireworks went off in front of the Hôtel de Ville, but there were so many people crammed in that after the great firework display, they began to be crushed, and some people tripped, and others tripped over the trips. And then there was a stampede, and finally a dozen people were killed. So the Great Peace was known to ordinary Parisians as a disaster. And there are reports that for the following days, when fishmongers in the marketplaces wanted to quarrel and insult one another, they said, "You are as stupid as the peace." So that's a good idea, a good example, I think, of the way people took in news reports. Ordinary people, not just the sophisticates in Versailles who were better informed. People, pamphlets, of course, were everywhere, but very few people could read them. We have some information about literacy. It's not terribly trustworthy. Probably 3/4 of adult males could read in a primitive way, but whether they could read an entire pamphlet is something else. However, they took in pamphlets news through their ears because pamphlets were read aloud. I found an example of a pamphlet that was read aloud outside of the Café du Foy in the gardens of the Palais Royal by an orator with a big voice, and there were hundreds of people listening to him. It was a pro-government pamphlet, but the crowd was anti-government. So they interrupted with boos and catcalls. And then when this took a good half hour, when the reading was finished, they put the pamphlet on trial. They actually set it up on a table. They appointed a prosecuting attorney and a judge and a public executioner who cut it in pieces with his sword and set it on fire. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, the printed word matters, but it's accompanied by performances and a tremendous amount of theatricality, which you find everywhere in the diaries and police reports and all the primary sources concerning pre-revolutionary Paris. Well, so I'm describing different kinds of media, if you like, in a sense. Hurdy-gurdies or primitive fiddles. They sang songs to tunes that everyone knew. Now, I think it's true of us today. We all share a collective repository of tunes. And these tunes were extremely widespread in 18th century Paris. I know because I've done a close study of all the records of all the songs. They were enormous, and they were collected in sort of scrapbooks known as chansonniers. One of the chansonniers in the National Library of Paris runs to 54 enormous folio volumes for the mid-18th century years. And another chansonnier in yet another library that I've studied has 641 songs, just 13 huge volumes just for the period 1745 to 1752. So you can see people are improvising new words to old tunes every day, and they function as a kind of sung newspaper. Also, they were tremendous mnemonic devices. Um, I think maybe some of you have in your heads some of the same tunes that I have in mind. Mine are mostly kind of Tin Pan Alley tunes from the 1950s or ads. I'll give you an example. Pepsi Cola hits the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much and better too. Pepsi Cola is a drink for you. Well, everyone in the country, I think, knew that. But one day in third grade, a wise guy appeared and he sang the following version of the song. Christianity hits the spot, 12 apostles, that's a lot. Holy Ghost and a virgin too. Christianity's a thing for you. I was deeply shocked. It was the first time I had ever collided with irreligion, and I can't get it out of my head. Well, people couldn't get out of their head all kinds of songs that are circulating everywhere, much to the distress of the government and the police. The police took these songs seriously. I've studied the archives in the Bastille. They're obsessed with songs. And in fact, one Parisian wit, Nicolas Chamfort, said, France is an absolute monarchy tempered by songs. So everyone recognizes that songs had power to shape public opinion, and public opinion mattered. In fact, it mattered so much that on April 24th, 1749, a song brought down the government. Now, that may seem extravagant to you, but I've studied all of the documentation surrounding it. And there was one song in particular that spelled doom for the most powerful man in the government, the Comte de Maurepas, who had been a key minister for decades. The song went as follows. Par vos façons nobles et franches, Iris, vous enchantez nos cœurs. Sur nos pas, vous semez des fleurs, mais ce sont des fleurs blanches. That was the song. I can't sing it for you, but translated, it said, by your frank and noble manner, Iris, you enchant our hearts. On our path, you strew flowers, but they are white flowers. That brought down the government. Well, it's a good example of how opaque history can be unless you really get deep inside the current ways of thinking. So the background was a particular incident, a dinner in the so-called petits appartements, the private apartments of the king in Versailles. That's where he could relax, no protocol, and he spent a lot of time with his royal mistress, who at this time was Madame de Pompadour. At one dinner party, there were only 4 people: Pompadour, the king, Pompadour's cousin, and the minister, Maurepas. Madame de Pompadour arrived carrying some white hyacinths that she had picked herself, and in a sort of gallant gesture, she gave the flowers to the other 3 people. So that's the reference to white flowers, but in fact, it was a pun. Fleur, fleur, and it referred to a genital disease in menstrual fluid. In other words, the message of the song was Madame de Pompadour had given the king VD. And that was too much even for Parisians who were used to pretty strong stuff. It was blamed on Maurepas because he was the only one who would have known about this. And he was dismissed, cashiered, and exiled to the provinces. So that gives you an example of how another one of the media could actually be a factor in politics. Aside from songs, one of the most important means of distribution of news, of course, was rumor. Now, in 1749, the police were really the municipal government of Paris. The lieutenant general of police was one of the most powerful people in the kingdom, and he received an order to clean up the streets from street urchins who were bothering people. So police agents would go out, sometimes accompanied by soldiers, and they would pick up these ragged street kids, put them in carriages, and haul them off to prisons. Well, uh, they sometimes made mistakes, and they picked up children of craftsmen and bourgeois who were simply playing in the streets. And then they held them even for ransom in the prisons. Moreover, rumors circulated that these children were going to be sent to Mississippi, which was supposed to be a mountainous area in America where they were developing a silk industry, and they were going to be slaves working in the silk production. Of course, this is completely mythological, but it upset people who were worried about their children disappearing into Mississippi. And then finally, on one day, this was continued over and over again. And sometimes the children would scream when they were in the carriage, and people would come running out from shops, stop the carriage, beat up the police agents, and rescue the children. This happened on several occasions. And finally, on May 23rd, 1750, the crowd seized one police agent after chasing him through a large part of central Paris. They beat him to death. They dragged his body to the residence of the Lieutenant General of Police and left it on the front doorstep while the Lieutenant General ran out the back door. And the crowd took Paris. It controlled Paris for the rest of the night. So it's an example of the kind of violence that would burst out every once in a while in 18th century Paris. Moreover, it's accompanied by another rumor, not just about Mississippi, but about the true reason for seizing these children. They were kidnapped by the police in order to be bled and to have their blood used as a bloodbath for a prince who was suffering from some exotic disease, probably leprosy. Well, that referred to myths connected with the conversion of Constantine, and especially the massacre of the innocents by Herod in the Bible. And the police reported on this rumor. The reports reached Louis XV, and the king said, well, the Parisians are calling me a Herod. I'm not going to set foot in Paris anymore. That's 1749 to 1750. Of course, occasionally he did have to go to Paris, but he really began to lose touch with the Parisians. Rumors, of course, became attached to the mistresses of Louis XV. They began with the king's first mistresses, the three sisters of the Marquis de Nesle. Now, I should explain that, of course, kings were supposed to have mistresses. That didn't in itself anyone. There was even an official title, maîtresse en titre, for the mistress who would be presented at court and was be a major actor in the political life of the kingdom. But the French saw sex with sisters as incest, and they thought, moreover, that the whole kingdom would be punished because the king, who was still seen as a sacred figure, was sinning in this extreme way. The sexual singing of the king also upset the Parisians, their collective imagination, in another way, because on every Easter Sunday, he was supposed to walk through the Grande Galerie of the Louvre, where you see the great Italian paintings today, and the sick would be lined up in the gallery, people suffering from the king's disease, scrofula. And if they touched him, they would be cured. However, in order to maintain this spiritual power to heal, which went back to the Middle Ages, the king had himself to be purified. And to be purified, he had to take communion. To take communion, he had to make confession and renounce his mistress. But he wouldn't do that. He really was attached to Madame de Pompadour. So he no longer touched the sick on Easter Day in the Louvre. He was losing his royal, he lost his royal touch, and he, in fact, lost contact with the people of Paris. In fact, he so detested the Parisians that he had a special road built around Paris so that when he left Versailles to Compiègne, where he liked to go hunting, he wouldn't have to pass through the city. In other words, what we're talking about is a progressive sense of alienation of the Parisians from the king. Madame de Pompadour, of course, she inspired a lot of gossip, and she had a very unfortunate maiden name, Poisson, fish. So there were endless songs and poems punning about fish, and it became an actual genre known as poissonnade. I can read you one just to give you the feel of it. Si la cour se ravale, pourquoi s'étonne-t-on? N'est-ce pas de la halle que nous vient le poisson? If the court loses its dignity, we be surprised. Isn't it from the market that we get our fish? So she's being scorned as a common person. And in fact, royal mistresses were always supposed to belong to the aristocracy, to be part of the court. But Madame de Pompadour was the first royal mistress who was a bourgeoise. And then the next, well, she was, I mean, that was shocking in itself. But what really upset the Parisians were all of these rumors about the enormous expense that she occurred. All kinds of pensions, jewels, estates, including the Élysée Palace, where the president of France lives today, and the exquisite Chateau de Bellevue. And not only were millions spent on her, to the disgust of Parisians who were paying heavy taxes on simple things like candles, she also exerted political powers. She named some key ministers, including a man called Machaut and another called Berny, and even the Prince de Soubise, who commanded the French forces in the next war, the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War. Soubise was a disaster as a general. He was defeated at the Battle of Rosbach by Frederick II. who had only half as many soldiers as he did. So Madame de Pompadour was a disaster, not just because she was a bourgeoise, but because her intervention in public affairs was just cursed, it seemed, to the French people. Her successor, Madame du Barry, did not become involved in politics. She had no interest in public affairs, but she had been a prostitute. We've actually found the reports of the police showing precisely who bought her when she was rented out at very high class casinos. And so this is really making the royal mistress as tawdry as it could be, despite her great beauty. And these rumors about her life in the demi-monde circulated everywhere with all kinds of anecdotes about her, this incident and that incident, which I could recount to you, but there isn't time. But they're really interesting, amusing, and often quite shocking. And they were brought together now in the 1770s in books, which were actually biographies of the royal mistress as a whore who is finally promoted to the crucial position in the court. There is one book is called Secret Anecdotes about Madame du Barry. Another wonderful book in 4 volumes is The Private Life of Louis XV. It's very intelligent, very well recounted, very risque. It was a bestseller. I've got statistics on which books sold best, of course, completely prohibited. But in the underground, it was a spectacular bestseller. It was translated into English. And in fact, at Harvard, we have a copy of the English translation with the name of the owner written across the title page, George Washington. So this gives you some indication of how this mythology accompanying royal mistresses spread everywhere. Now, Louis, one of the things that these books reveal was how Louis XV finally died. Because at the end, Madame de Pompadour turned procuress, and she collaborated with the king's valet, a man called Dominique Guillaume le Bel, to find wherever they could attractive young girls. He liked them young, as we've heard about people today. They came across a 16-year-old peasant girl working in the fields. She was beautiful. They picked her up, scraped the mud off of her, dressed her enticingly, and served her up to the king. Well, unknown to everyone, she had a case of smallpox. She broke out with smallpox the day after the one-night stand with Louis XV and died soon afterwards. Naturally, Louis caught the disease and he too died. The cause of his death is related in this literature. And when he did finally pass away on May 10th, 1774, Paris broke out with rejoicing. Now, Louis XVI did not suffer from this kind of sexual rumor mongering, but his impeccable morals exposed him to gossip of another kind, his lack of virility. He failed to father an heir to the throne for 5.5 years after his marriage to Marie Antoinette. And this was attributed to a deficiency in the royal penis. So, he was scorned for the opposite reasons as Louis XV. there was a simple operation that resolved that problem, and finally heirs were born to the throne. But the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who gave birth to these heirs, began to look worse and worse in the eyes of the Parisians. I won't go into detail concerning the enormous literature about Marie Antoinette, but I would like to mention another ceremony, because it's through ceremony, the acting out and parading of information, that Parisians were informed. So, in fact, Marie Antoinette was married to Louis XVI by proxy in Vienna, but then the official announcement, so to speak, of her marriage took place in the form of a royal entrée to Paris on June 8, 1773. So they paraded in the Dauphin, he was not yet king, Marie Antoinette. There were lots of public ceremonies. Again, you got feasting, free wine, free sausages, free bread in various neighborhoods of Paris, I think 25 neighborhoods, with bands playing and public dancing. And the whole thing came to a climax with more fireworks. Now, supposedly the most spectacular fireworks display ever. The master firework organizer, an artificier, as he was called, built an elaborate temple to marriage to celebrate the wedding. It was 35 feet high. And then he had fiery spin wheels and fountains placed on what is today the Place de la Concorde. And the whole thing was going to come to a climax with a rocket that would be sent up into the air. Well, the crowd gathered, they were packed in again tightly. And unfortunately, when they started to set off all of the fireworks, the rocket took fire, hit the temple of marriage, and the whole thing burned down instantly. It was a spectacular flop, which was over before it had really begun. And people, some tripped, others tripped over them. There was a stampede, and 132 bodies laid out dead just behind the Place, now what we call the Place de la Concorde. Rumors had it that 3,000 people had actually been killed. So this was taken by the Parisians not just as a disaster, but as an omen that the wedding would be bring a disastrous future to France. Now, another form of spreading information actually was rioting. There was a word for riots that I think is very revealing: émotion populaire, popular emotions. In other words, the explosion of passion in the streets, taking a violent form, but with a great deal of theatricality, of acting things out. One of the most important riots of this sort occurred on May 3rd, 1775, because the price of bread had spiraled out of control. Bread was the main ingredient in the diet of the poor in Paris. And things got so desperate that on that day, they began pillaging bakeries. They pillaged about 1,000 bakeries in Paris, and there were riots that spread everywhere, at least 123 in the greater Paris area. So a tremendous amount of looting, and it was also accompanied by a kind of mythological view called the Famine Pact. The Parisians heard that speculators were monopolizing the grain, holding it back so the price would rise to an enormous level and they would make a killing by selling it off. And who was at the top of the famine pact? The king himself, or at least his ministers. So that's another example of the kind of misinformation that circulated everywhere. By the 1780s, this violence took an explicit political form. There had been bread riots stretching way back into the past, but now there were riots connected directly, aimed directly at the government. In 1788, there were two key ministers, Loménie de Brienne and Chrétien François de Lamoignon. And they were suffering under imminent bankruptcy because the royal treasury was running dry, largely because of the French support of Americans during the American Revolution, but also there was a structural defect in the whole system of collecting taxes. And so these ministers, these two hated ministers, tried to force new taxes on the French in general, the Parisians in particular. And the Parisians resisted violently, forcing finally the king to dismiss the ministers. I won't go into the details, but what's interesting is the way the Parisians celebrated their victory in again bringing down the government. After the fall of Brienne on August 26, 1788, the Parisians built an enormous straw man, dressed him up in the costumes of Brienne, who was a bishop, actually an archbishop. So he was recognizable. They paraded around the center of Paris. They made it confess its sins, and then they burned it in a giant bonfire. Then, as they continued to raise hell, the police arrived and violent rioting broke out. And there were 80 persons wounded and 20 killed. So you've got very widespread violence after the fall of the first minister. And then after the fall of the second one, Lamoignon, a few weeks later, more violence broke out. There were 80 people killed. And again, they paraded around a straw man, put him on trial, and burned him. So there's a lot of theatricality. And what I would underline is the carnivalesque idiom in which this was done, derived from Mardi Gras, the idea of burning straw men. So there was a lot of politics expressed in non-verbal language, which everyone could understand. Now, as you probably have noticed, I have described these few episodes in chronological order, going from 1748 to 1788. And of course, I've had to leave out a great deal, but I want to illustrate the way the information system actually operated at that time, not to recount a full-scale history. By emphasizing the non-print media, however, I don't mean to say that ideas did matter. Montesquieu and Rousseau, which was that the monarchy had degenerated into a despotism. And despotism is the key word that appears again and again in the pamphlets and in the rioting. So instead of developing a conventional history of ideas, what I'm trying to do is to show how ideas and attitudes actually took form among the common people as well as the elite uh, including people who could barely read. The point I'm trying to make is that through the accumulation of all of these episodes, the regime lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the Parisians. And this process included a great deal of misinformation, such as the rumor of the bloodbath, for example, connected with the police kidnappings of 1749, and the rumor of the famine plot in 1775. So by the end of 1788, Parisians had developed what I call a revolutionary temper. That is to say, a collective uh, outlook which readied them to take the great leap into revolution in 1789. Now, no direct parallels align the storming of the Bastille with events today, not even to the riots which have been occurring all the time in Paris or to the uprising of January 6th, 2021 in Washington. But I do think that a cumulative collective sense of crisis is building up in this country, magnified by the media, and that it is eroding the legitimacy, which is the foundation of uh, modern political systems. This, just as it did in France 250 years ago. To appreciate the power of this process, I think we can learn from the way information undermined the old regime in France. The study of the media in 18th century Paris shows that events do not come naked into the public sphere. They come clothed in attitudes, values, outlooks, memories of the past, hopes for the future, and all kinds of emotions, including émotions populaires, popular emotions. So to understand events, I think it's crucial to describe the perceptions that accompanied the events because they are inseparable. Their combined effects, I've argued, demonstrate the vulnerability of a regime to an information system, even one without television and the internet. Today, we do not stand on the edge of something similar to 1789, but the way information is produced and perceived threatens the collective conviction of legitimacy which holds our republic together. For my part, I don't believe that history teaches lessons in a direct way, but the study of the coming of the French Revolution can alert us to a danger that threatens democracy today.
Thank you so much, Professor Darnton. That was there was so much there to unpack, and I think your conclusion is very powerful for all of us to think about. We have a comment. Thank you for your brilliant work. Second, your research reminds me of John Adams' statement that the American Revolution happened first in the minds and hearts of the people. You might add, in their sense of humor and boisterous irreverence also. Thank you, Liz. And we have a question. What was the primary source of news about the American Revolution for Parisians?
Yes. Well, by the time of the American Revolution, you did get more underground newspapers of the kind I mentioned, but also a very significant increase in actual newspapers in French, but published outside of France, especially in the Low Countries, in Leiden, Amsterdam, also in Brussels. And these newspapers circulated in a fairly large number, so that the Gazette de Leyde, the Gazette of Leiden, was a an excellent newspaper. I think almost as good as some today. It had correspondence in America. And so if you read it, you read, a letter from Boston, a letter from New York, a letter from some other more obscure places. Of course, it took forever for this news to cross the Atlantic and make its way in from English into French, but it was arriving all the time. So there were reports about actual battles. They were amazingly inaccurate often. 4 times it was reported that Washington had been killed in the fighting. But eventually, the news arrived that, especially connected with Lafayette, who was a great hero then. And Lafayette came back at one point to try to raise money to support the Americans. When France finally, with a great deal of help by Benjamin Franklin, the representative of the revolutionary colonies, when France decided actually wage war with the Americans, of course, that opened up more sources of information. So the information arrived. It was imperfect, it was slow, but it did interest people, although a lot of people didn't especially pay attention until afterwards, when there was rejoicing at the defeat of the British. And then the cult of the American really began to take hold. Part of it was spread by Franklin, especially, who had a genius for touching the French imagination, later by Jefferson. But a great deal of it derived from Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur. Crèvecoeur was a Norman Frenchman who had gone to Canada and then had set up a farm in New York, married an American, had children, and then came back and published first in English, because he almost lost his French. He had stayed there so long, a book called Letters from an American Farmer. And it was translated into French. And I've compared the translations. There were 2 editions, one in 2 volumes, another in 3 volumes. And the French, in translating it, just blew it up into this extraordinary mythical account of noble savages and good Yankees and Quakers and Nantucket fishermen, and made the country look like a sort of paradise. So that maybe that's too long an answer, but there is a chapter in my book about the cult of America as it developed during and after the American Revolution.
Yes, it's a wonderful chapter. We have another question. Did Lafayette get caught up in any of this Parisian media frenzy?
Lafayette.
Mhm.
Oh, yes. He certainly did. Of course, he was only 19 when he first crossed the ocean to fight with Washington. He wasn't allowed to do that. I mean, he had to do it secretly. He was forbidden. And he actually bought a boat to cross the Atlantic on his own. He fought with Washington. He was wounded. And, this information about this began filtering back, so that he was the most sort of young, dashing hero you could imagine from a famous family. And he came back, as I said, and raised money as the French decided to actually enter the war with the Americans. And following that, once peace had been declared, he brought back American Indians who served as houseboys in his Parisian hotel, the townhouse. So Houdon made a bust of him, which was put on exhibition in the Hotel de Ville. I mean, his picture is reproduced in cheap pamphlets and so on. So yes, Lafayette was tremendously admired and appeared as a terrific hero his wife gave birth to several children, and he named them after first Washington and then after American states. So Franklin joked that Virginia worked okay in French, Virginie, but what Franklin said, he wasn't sure that little Massachusetts would be happy with the name inflicted on him. So yes, I mean, Lafayette was absolutely a hero, and that was going to launch him into a spectacular and disastrous role in the French Revolution.
Thank you. Do you think, this is another question, do you think the culture of revolution you have found among the French leading up to the French Revolution is a necessary ingredient of any successful revolution?
Well, the culture of revolution, of course, the most spectacular revolution before 1789 was the English Revolution, as some called it. Others called it the Civil War from 1640 to 1660. And that produced an enormous amount of literature, which was translated into French, and of course, a lot of political theory. And then the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, which I think was far more influential in France. So you got Locke's second treatise on civil government and all kinds of works like that. So the concept of revolution was attached to England, which was seen by the French as inflammable, a riotous country. Such things would not happen in France, people thought at first. But some have argued that the very word revolution had not yet acquired its modern meaning. And often it's connected with the verb to revolve, to turn in circles. But there are instances in which révolution in French is used to mean a dramatic change in politics. So it's, it begins to acquire a kind of political specificity, but it's still weak. And so you could argue that it's the French Revolution itself that gives to the word this tremendous explosiveness, which it has carried ever since. The Russians in the Russian Revolution studied the French Revolution, and they were waiting for phases like the terror, like the Thermidorian reaction, to occur in Russia as they had occurred in the model revolution, which was French. So I think that the French Revolution acquired this tremendous power to inspire, incite revolutionary movements ever after, and also to spread fear of revolution.
Another question is, did the French regime try to counteract the damaging rumors with pro-regime rumors?
Oh, that's a good question. And the answer is yes, of course. They are very conscious of the power of rumors, of songs, of the kinds of things I've been talking about. I found several reports, much to my surprise, of the police going to the sort of maître d' who controlled cafes, who administered cafes, saying, don't permit your clients to talk about one incident or another incident, such as the fall of the Maurepas government that I mentioned. And they planted rumors of their own. I talked about these underground manuscript news sheets. Well, almost all of them passed through the police because the police couldn't stop it, and so they tried to direct it. And it wasn't exactly censorship. Well, it was actually. I mean, they could forbid particular news sheets, but that wasn't really effective because new ones would grow up. And therefore, you got a kind of police gazette that began to circulate and that gave a much more favorable impression of things. And of course, the government hired pamphleteers. And during every major crisis, they would churn out pamphlets that expressed the government's view of things. This was especially true during the Great Crisis between 1771 and 1775, known as the Maupeou Revolution, because the word was used then. And you got an enormous pamphlet war. So yes, the government did try to manipulate public opinion. In fact, under Louis XVI, edicts no longer appeared in the same way. They would have preambles, and the preambles would explain the purpose of the edicts, appealing to public opinion. Turgot, in particular, when he was finance minister, wrote long edicts justifying the government's actions. So yes, there was definitely an attempt to win over public opinion, and sometimes it was fairly successful, but it was drowned out in 1787 and 1788.
Well, just checking the chat. We have a complimentary comments here. I guess as we wrap up, I'd like to encourage people. I mean, this is a wonderful, interesting book. It's fun, it's sobering. The role of religion, of lawsuits, of song, of the police spying on people singing songs. I mean, it goes on. And I think that to think about it with parallels to our own time and to other revolutions is a really interesting exercise. So I encourage everyone to buy the book and read it, or get it out of your library and read it. But it is a wonderful, wonderful book. So I want to thank you, Professor Darnton, for being with us tonight. And I appreciate your time, and for everyone who's been with us this evening, thank you. This has been recorded. I'll be sending you the recording. So if you want to watch it again and catch things you might not have caught, you have that opportunity. And I hope that we'll see you in February and in March and throughout the year for all of our programming. So thank you all, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.